Timothy Wells was a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, or R.I.T. His wife, Christine Sevilla, was a former instructor at R.I.T., a photographer, author, and environmental activist. And then there's Riley, their black and white Springer Spaniel. They referred to themselves as the Pack, and to anyone on the outside looking in, it most likely appeared grand for those members of the Pack. Until one morning, Timothy Wells knew it was time. In his mind, all he kept thinking was one thing over and over: this has got to end. Hello. Welcome to another episode of What Were They Thinking? True Crime Podcast. I'm your host, Philip Tomaso. Oh, good morning, everybody. Today is Monday, April 17th, 2023. I am Philip Tomaso, the host of What Were They Thinking? True Crime Podcast. We have what I consider something of an interesting episode today. Not only does the case we discuss today involve a murder, but it also is interesting because I know the young lady who was the 911 call taker when the murderer called 911 to report what he had done. Additionally, a book was written about this particular crime, and several years back, I reached out to the local author, Rochester, New York doctor, who spent untold hours of time with the killer, interviewing him and compiling everything he uncovered into a sanctioned book. I then met with the author to obtain signed copies for my friend who took the 911 call and for myself. Of course, I did not realize at the time, all of these years later, that I would be doing a true crime podcast. The author is Dr. Jared M. Fisher, and he's currently with the University of Rochester, a voluntary clinical associate professor with the Department of Psychiatry and a geriatric psychiatrist. He's also a forensic neuropsychologist with over 4 decades of experience. Dr. Fisher's extensive professional career includes the founding of innovative businesses, collaborative works, articles, publications, consultation, and speaking engagements at the leading edge of neuropsychology. Dr. Fisher is also a leader in support of many community based projects, charities, and the National Academy of Neuropsychology Foundation. He's a relatable, down to earth guy. I've talked to him a couple of times now, and it just amazes me. Great person, all around, just a great person. His book, entitled Upside Down, was published in August of 2013 by Pelican Publishing. I believe I read it in one sitting at the time. It is it's actually the only it was the let me rephrase that. It is actually the second true crime book that I'd ever read at that time. The first was John Grisham's The Innocent Man. However, Upside Down just is amazing. So I relied for this particular episode, I relied heavily on Upside Down for some of the details about the crime, because other than the doctor's book, there's not much else written on the subject, on the case. I tried doing tons of Google searches, and there's not much, but his book covers a lot that the newspapers never released. So we're going to get some really deep inside looks here, thanks to Dr. Fisher. Um, so I'm hoping you keep listening, because this is a truly, it's one of those cases where it gives you chills. This one gives you chills. It gave me chills. So, however, Upside Down is about a murder that took place in Rochester. With every street and location mentioned, it's familiar to me because I've said since day one I am doing Western New York based cases, because that's where that's where I live and where I was raised and where I still live. The way this nightmare unfolds in the book is more suspenseful than any other true crime book I've ever read to date. Okay, so I did reach out to the former telecommunicator who was on the call with the murderer, which I promised. gives this the devil's bathtub quite a bit of added flavor. My friend who took the 911 call prefers not to be mentioned by name. She spent several years working at 911 before she took another job doing something else more law enforcement like related. And we've remained good friends pretty much from the time I started and even until today, which is wow, it's almost 2 decades. So the case we're about to dive into, I know I'm being all hey secretive, but I don't want to give too much away before we get going. It occurred on November 30th, 2009. That's not how you say that. It occurred on November 30th, 2009, just 1 month after I began working at 911 myself. And for the purpose of the podcast and to protect my friend's identity, I'm merely going to refer to my dear friend, my dear friend, as the 911 operator, or I might say the call taker. But the term is telecommunicator, the actual, but we'll say the 911 operator. I'm also going to make one disclaimer here, something I generally avoid because this is a podcast about true crime for adults. If that isn't a warning in and of itself that there may be sensitive material, then I can't help you. You probably shouldn't be listening to podcasts about true crime. But this one's a little different, and I am going to make the disclaimer. Now, in this particular episode, all I want to say up front, here it comes. No animals get killed in this episode. I don't want to put the cart before the horse. The tension and suspense are still going to be there. And I don't want to ruin an ending or a surprise for my listeners. However, I know more than half of you care more about animals than you do people. Present company included. I love my dog, Zeddy. So, this is exactly why this one time I am putting in this disclaimer for you to keep in mind while listening because I don't want people to get so apprehensive about what's about to come they quit listening or stop following me, okay? I'm very sensitive to the to animals and people and their feelings about animals. So one last time I reiterate, no animals are killed in this episode, okay? Okay. All right. Now I know this is a lot of intro. This is a lot of build up, and you're beginning to wonder. You're like, what in the blazes happened in Rochester, New York? And you're like, get to the point. Here's the point. Here we go. You ready? Timothy Wells, who was at this time in 2009, 57 years old, worked as an associate professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology. This is where he taught computing and information sciences courses, and he studied media psychology himself. He was married to 58-year-old Christine Sevilla. She's a former, she was a former instructor at R.I.T, a photographer and an author, and a very engaging environmental activist. She also founded and owned Lumen Guild. The firm launched back in 1987 with it designs instructional and career planning systems, web-based conferences, focus groups, and e-learning are among many of the services that Lumen Guild offered. And clients have ranged from nonprofits to Fortune 500 companies. Ms. Sevilla also designed staff development and education programs at the University of Rochester Medical Center and was a health consultant. The two, here's the two also shared their love with Riley. Riley was their black and white Springer Spaniel. I do have the pictures on my promo of the family of the dog of everybody. Family lived at Springwood Lane in Pittsburgh. This is a two-bedroom, two-bathroom ranch-style home, 2,300 square feet, soaring ceilings, skylights, a gas fireplace, and plenty of windows for viewing wildlife in the woodsy backyard. The home has an estimated resale value today of $333,000. This is not to say that the couple was rich, but the couple was doing very well for themselves. Pittsford is considered a more of a wealthy area to live in when you're looking at Monroe County. This is just I just wanted to give you some background. I wanted to give you some kind of a picture of the people we'll be talking about from here on out. The college professors, professionals. They lived on the east side of the county, okay? Just to paint this for you to envision. Early Monday morning, November 30th, 2009, it was a very typical late fall kind of day. The crisp temperatures throughout averaged around 36 degrees. It was dry, calm winds, cloudy. Um, Brisk might be the perfect way to describe the weather, and there was snow, a first snow, in the forecast for later that night. Christine was in the process of setting up a meeting at a nearby coffee shop. With no in home office, the local Starbucks suited her needs nicely. Tim, who should already be on campus, in fact, he should be about to begin a new class lecture at R.I.T. For the last several years, Tim struggled with keeping up with ever changing technologies. The continual advances in computer science has left him feeling inadequate. He wasn't just falling behind the times, he had fallen. He had fallen and he couldn't manage to pick himself back up. So Christine's planning a meeting and Tim should already be on campus, okay? He was supposed to teach two new classes. He was supposed to teach two new classes that morning, one at 10 a.m. and the other at 12:30. But he never prepared for the classes. He never wrote up lectures. And while he had wung it in the past, he wasn't at all ready to fake his way through these new courses. The inadequacies he felt were so strong, so overwhelming, that the idea of suicide sounded better than admitting to the world, to his family and his friends, and to his wife that he was, in fact, a failure, a fraud. This is how this man was feeling. Christine frequently told him that he was the only one who would ever put up with her. They had that kind of a bond in Tim's mind. So the idea of committing suicide and leaving her all by herself haunted him. He needed a better plan than just taking his own life. He considered that almost selfish. To keep his wife from suffering forever without him, the brilliant idea to kill her too seemed like the only and most perfect path forward. His wife was getting ready to leave for her Starbucks meeting, and Tim knew it was now or never. Let's back up a little. Tim taught 6 online classes with a total of fewer than 20 students. The students left bad reviews for their professor, often wondering how Wells was still had a teaching position with the college. The students reported he was hands off, that he added no value to the coursework, and one even said their cat could have taught the course better. Embarrassed, Tim never shared these humiliating reviews with his wife. On November 11th, this is a couple weeks before, Tim had been dismissed from a PhD course in media psychology. His wife did not know this. He had been unable to own up to the failure. His dismissal wouldn't negate the accrued student loan debt of $64,000 either. So he's kicked out of the program. He still owes the money up to the point that he was kicked out, and he didn't tell his wife about any of this. So you add the PhD dismissal on the 11th to the email he received back in February of the same year, 2009, so earlier in the year, informing him the Learning and Knowledge Management System program, which he started in 2005, was now being canceled. And the reason? It wasn't popular. Not enough students showed an interest in taking the courses. Tim's wife wasn't aware of this shameful notification either. So in Tim's mind, everything is just building and building and building. His sister, Tim's sister, that is, had been diagnosed with cancer. And Tim made trips to Ohio, where he donated bone marrow uh, in July of 2009. But regardless of his efforts, she passed away in September 2009. On this particular morning, back to the present, or the present in this case, when there was still some time to sketch an outline for his morning classes, Tim instead asked his wife if she wanted to go to the YMCA in Parrington and get a workout in. And they did. And now, as she's getting ready to head out for her meeting, Tim admitted some of his fears. And he told her he was apprehensive about the new courses. Ever supportive, she told him not to worry about him, that his students loved him, and that he could teach on personality alone. If she only knew the half of it, because at this moment, Tim was thinking, this has to end. And he thought it over and over. Tim knew appearance mattered to Christine. Appearances mattered to her. And she was the wife of a college professor, and that meant something to her. But he'd gone and blown it. He'd ruined everything. He was faced only with his truth that this had to end. He had failed his family miserably in his eyes. He saw no other choice but to kill Christine and to kill Riley, their dog, and himself. So while she prepared to leave the house, he came up behind her and he strangled her to death. He knew that strangulation, as Dr. Jared Fisher writes in his book, Upside Down, is one of the most intimate, protracted means of murder to kill his devoted wife. He considered this a death pact. The three of them had always referred to themselves as the pact. This was the demise of that pact. Tim didn't yet feel remorse so much as he felt relief. He was so glad he didn't have to go to work, that he would never have to go to R.I.T again. And that relief just flooded through him. He didn't have to worry about the PhD program, research projects. He didn't have to worry about his students. He didn't have to worry about Christine suffering without him. And soon he wouldn't have to worry about Riley feeling all alone. The best part was, in Tim's way of thinking, after today, there was no one left to disappoint. Okay, the story does not end here, folks. Instead, this is where it gets out of control, and weirdly so. When Tim had fleeting suicidal thoughts in the past, he always just imagined like driving into oncoming traffic, right? This nice, simple way to end things for himself. Forget about the person he's head on colliding with. So his suicidal plan had just become far more complicated. The idea of killing his dog and then himself in the house with Christine already dead on the floor didn't make as much sense. It didn't seem as fitting. Knowing Christine loved photography and photographing the wild, and that her favorite place to take pictures was out at Mendon Ponds. Let me just tell you, Mendon Ponds Park is the largest county park in Monroe. It's got 2,000 acres of woodlands, ponds, wetlands, and glacially created landforms. It is a beautiful park. I've gone out there many, many times. I'll just real quick digress. You go out there in the winter with this birdseed in your hand, and if you stand really still on the trails and hold the birdseed out up in the air in the palm of your hand, the chickadees and other birds will fly to it, and they'll land on the edges of your fingers and they'll eat the seeds right out of your hand. Also, deer will come right up to you for carrots. Squirrels come right up to you as well. Beautiful, beautiful park. Anyway, inside Mendon Ponds was a trail known as Horizon Hill, a favorite trail the family enjoyed walking. And it might be a part of the county where Tim felt Christine always was happiest. So Tim now hoisted Christine's corpse into the front passenger seat of his Saturn, which is a car. I don't think they make them anymore. Riley climbed into the back seat of the car. So then Tim thought better of it. He thought he couldn't drive around with his dead wife in the passenger seat. So after putting a large tarp into the bottom of his trunk, he placed Christine's body onto the tarp and folded the corners over her so she was covered. The tarp would keep Christine from being seen should he need to open his trunk for any reason. And he could also use the tarp like a sled to drag his wife's body up Horizon Hill. So he's really thinking this through. According to Dr. Jared Fisher, Tim then retrieved both Christine's purse and his purse from the kitchen. Tim didn't worry about what others thought about him when it came to masculinity, right? Tall, good looking, and heterosexual, Tim was far from macho, according to Tim himself in talking with Dr. Fisher. Besides, Tim had explained he and Christine had not been sexually intimate in over 5 years. So there was some other things going on here besides his failures. So he grabbed a sheet from the mudroom to lay Christine on and for him and Riley to lay on once the death pack was complete up at Horizon Hill. So he thought about, what this way they're not on the cold, hard ground. And then to finish the pack, he needed to decide how he was going to end the remaining two lives. He figured a knife would work best. Humanely, he could slit Riley's throat, and then once Riley was gone, he could slice up his own wrists, and then the three of them could all be together on a sheet in the park at the top of Horizon Hill. This is what this man is thinking. Before he went back to the car in the garage, he figured a glass or two of wine before the final acts of death seemed fitting, and not sure if he would prefer red or white, what the mood might require. He snatched up a bottle of each as well as a corkscrew. He brought with he brought it all back to the car. He's got his wife's body wrapped in a tarp in the trunk. It should have been then about a 20-minute drive, around 10 miles from where they were in Pittsburgh to Horizon Hill and Mendon Ponds. But instead, this became an all-day ordeal. Tim drove all over the place. He even crossed the Genesee River, venturing out to what is known as the west side of Monroe County. And he stopped at a fast food drive-through in Brockport, New York, and got something to eat as the day wore on. He was about as far from Mendon Ponds as he could get without going all the way north to Lake Ontario. But eventually, Wells did make it to Mendon Ponds. He struggled to remove his wife from the trunk, and he set her on the tarp and dragged her out to the perfect spot. But it took more time and effort than he anticipated. It was late into the night by now, or later into the evening by now. Riley, ever faithful, followed along. No idea what was going on. Had to suspect things were not normal with the family right now. Once Tim reached the spot, a couple of things happened. First, he realized he had forgotten the knife or lost it. Maybe it was back at the car. He couldn't be certain. It was far too dark to go searching for it. And it didn't mean he had failed at the death pact. Not yet. He could still take care of Riley. It might not be as smooth or as humane as slitting her throat with a knife, but he thought with a big enough rock, he could crush the dog's skull. And it should be fast and painless for Riley. This is what he's thinking. This is where he's completely losing grip with reality. I mean, he's lost grip with reality, but here's what's really unfolding on him. So he finds a rock that should do the trick, and he calls Riley over. She's clearly apprehensive by the entire day, by Tim's bizarre behavior. But reluctantly, Riley did come when called. Tim attempted to kill Riley with a vicious single bash of the rock against the dog's head, but only delivered a glancing blow. Riley was like, and pardon my French, but Riley's like, fuck this shit. She took off. I say she. I don't know if it's a boy or a girl dog. The dog took off into the park. She wasn't having any of it anymore. So Tim, watching Riley take off, sits back and he realizes this dawns on him once again what an absolute failure I am. Christine's dead. Riley's loose. He didn't even have the knife handy to take his own life. So, what he finally does, because the whole day is a complete mess, is he loads the body of his wife back into the trunk of his Saturn and attempted bringing her back down the hill in the car, in the Saturn. It's now snowing. The roads aren't great. And he's in a park, and he ends up getting stuck right by what is known as the Devil's Bathtub in Mendon Ponds. The Devil's Bathtub, and I do have a picture of it on the website and stuff. It's one of New York's rare barometric lakes, similar to Green Lakes, which you have to Google Green Lakes. It's a very convoluted explanation of all of it, but it's similar to a Green Lake. It's so deep and so protected by the geological features around it that the layers in the water do not mix or turn over. Okay, so they kind of stay. Think oil and vinegar in one container. They don't mix. Its depth roughly 47 feet at its deepest point. Actually, we're going to talk more about Devil's Bathtub in another episode coming later this year or maybe into season 2. But Tim's entire plan has unraveled. He's got a list of failures for the day added to his ever growing list of failures in his life. So Timothy Wells does the only thing he can think to do at this point. He doesn't even have his dog with him. The dog's still out in the park. He calls 911. And here's where I'm just going to be reading this. The following is what my friend, the TCC, the 911 operator, remembered about that day. Now, it's been years. So she wrote back answers to a list of my questions. Quite honestly, her narrative is perfect without me breaking it down by question, answer, question, answer. So the following is in her words, okay? And I'm just going to read it right out as she wrote it. And she writes, so as I said, I remember this call as being the one I remember the most, or at least the one that affected me the most. I went home that morning after work. I did not sleep for days. For days. I thought I was okay, but clearly I was not. I remember trying to unload the call and my emotions on my ex husband, and he didn't seem to care. I guess that's why he's an ex. So I might have the date wrong, but I think it was December 1st, 2009. It was the first snowfall of winter, and there was a dusting out in the parking lot at work. It was dead at work. And I took a call from a cell phone out in no man's land in Rush or Mendon. 911 center, I answered. On the other end was the voice of what I perceived as an old man. He said he needed an ambulance at Mendon Ponds Park, and he was whimpering. He said he was at the Devil's Bathtub. I remember rolling my eyes, thinking some old man must have gone for a stroll in the park in the middle of the night and fell and hurt himself. I remember feeling annoyed. I asked him the tell me exactly what happened line, and he kept crying and whimpering. Now I'm really annoyed. I think I ended up using an unknown code type because I wasn't sure what was happening, and I wanted to get someone started his way as soon as possible, figuring a first responder can sort through what was going on. So I got the job entered and responders going, and I stayed on the phone with him trying to get him to tell me what happened. Then he blurts it out. I killed my wife. I knew immediately he was telling the truth, and I panicked. What else can I say? I asked where she was now, and he said, in the car. I pictured a weekend at Bernie's type situation with her propped up in the front seat, but it turns out she was in the trunk. I asked what happened, and I thought he said he stabbed her. So I spent a minute and a half asking him where the knife was, only to find out he actually said he strangled her. Oh God, I was in over my head. I hit my mute switch so the caller couldn't hear me, and I yelled, "Supervisor!" A supervisor came floating over, and I told him what was going on, and he fed me more questions I could ask the caller. Where did the strangling happen? What was his home address? What was his full name, his social security number, his date of birth? All kinds of questions I had never asked a caller before. The whole time, this guy was still crying on the phone. I told him to stay on the line. I wanted him to stay on the line with me until officers arrived. It was literally 20 minutes. The police were nowhere near Mendon Pond Park. And once in the park, they had to snake around to find his car. He was stuck off a dirt path, and he had tried to drive down. Once I heard the sound of police on scene with him, I tried staying on the call, listening, but I couldn't really hear anything. I kept checking the job card all night, and sure enough, police uncovered a deceased female from the caller's trunk. I remember taking a break. God, excuse me. This chokes me up. I remember taking a break after ending the call, walking outside in the lightly falling snow. My ears were red hot from anxiety, and they were ringing like tinnitus. I remember the supervisors sending someone out to offer some type of peer support, but I declined it. I just wanted silence, to be left alone. It was so stressful. And I can't put my finger on why still. I think I was mad at myself because the whole time I was on the phone with a crying man who killed his wife, I felt bad for him. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. He seemed so sad and alone and old. This literally sticks with me to this day. And the thing I remember the most about this, I guess, was how sad he sounded. I'm thinking, I read the book by Dr. Jared Fisher, and I really believe Mr. Wells thought he was a failure and this was his only way out. I never had to testify because, if memory serves me correctly, Timothy Wells pleaded guilty and there was no trial. I think at one point I had an actual audio copy of the 911 call. The only other thing I could add is I remember going to Mendon Pond Park years after this call for a family get together. I had never been there before, literally. I was like 30 years old and I'd never been there. And I went down to the Devil's Bathtub. And if you've never been there, you have to take these makeshift stairs down to this pond. Being there at the Devil's Bathtub made me so uncomfortable. I've never gone back. And honestly, I'd be okay if I never have to. I don't want to see the Devil's Bathtub. I don't want to see Mendon Ponds Park. And I don't even like hearing the words Mendon Ponds. It gives me the creeps. It's so strange how our brains work. I probably need therapy. And she ends that. My friend ends that with a long H-A. She's laughing, but I don't know. That choked me up. You heard it. It choked me up. I understand these calls. I've taken these calls, not like this one, but it's impacting. And she sounds upset even now in 2023, 14 years later. Anyway, the former R.I.T professor did admit to strangling his wife, Christine Sevilla, and beating their dog. He pleaded guilty on October 13th, 2010 to intentional second-degree murder, and he waived his right to appeal. Timothy Wells was sentenced in November 2010, nearly 1 year after the events, and the judge said, "This was a senseless tragedy. There's nothing I can do to make time go back." At the time, the judge said Wells had been diagnosed with significant mental illness that could provide context for his actions, and that the court will consider that he has had no previous criminal record or history of violence. However, there is strength in knowing you need a helping hand, she had added. Unfortunately, Mr. Wells, you did not recognize that. This is what she told him. The judge gave Wells 16 years to life in prison. Thank you for listening to What Were They Thinking True Crime Podcast. As always, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. New episodes every Monday.